Hi, and welcome to our show brought to you from the U.S. This is obviously a difficult moment for the U.S.-China relationship, which tends to be held hostage by a third party or influence a third side in world politics. America has many allies. Australia, for example, has to decide whether its relations with China would be compromised on issues like Huawei or the South China Sea. Clearly, Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, follows changes in the power equation, and as head of the Policy Institute of Asian Society, has many thoughts on how to avert confrontation. I was honored to interview him in the U.S. Welcome to our discussion here, Prime Minister. Congratulations on the release of the latest book. It's called The Prime Years. What do you think is the most interesting chapter in this book about your political fortune and career?
Look, I'm the author. I can't give you an honest answer to that. Authors of autobiographies are never objective. They're always subjective. But for me, I mean, the important parts of the book deal with the question of the global financial crisis. I was in office throughout the crisis. I know how big a challenge it was for China's leadership at the time. I know how big a challenge it was for the American leadership at the time. And frankly, it took more than half of my time throughout my time in office dealing with it.
You see that leadership is flexible, to put it in a constructive way, but it could be criticized for being unpredictable, like presidency of Donald Trump, who unilaterally challenged the most consequential bilateral relationship in the 21st century between U.S. and China. So what do you think of the responsibility of leadership today?
Well, leadership in Western democracies is a hard thing, not just because you're dealing with the nature of the Western media, but also because you're dealing with changing domestic political sentiment. But here I think are the core qualities. One, having a clear set of values. What do you stand for? What do you believe in? So that the public, even if they don't understand the detail of the challenge you face today, understand the broad ethical framework you bring to bear in dealing with the challenges of the day. The second, I think, is this: based on those values, having a fairly clear policy vision for where you want the country to be in the future. And then thirdly, a set of policies which are capable of delivering that vision into reality. I think those three things are fundamental. The rest is kind of detail. If you're consistent about those three things, then by and large the public will stay with you. If you just chop and change every day, then you'll lose the public over time.
Throughout our life, we tend to ask two questions. One is, who am I? The other, where are you headed? When it comes to the image of Australia, the Chinese feel very confused as to what is the true image of Australia or national identity of Australia. You could be a nationalist economy or country when you look at the headlines of the local newspaper back in the year 2000 when Sydney hosted the Olympics. All this rise, that's a reflection of nationalistic sentiments, and I was shocked by this front page story on, mimic warfare of the local spectators. The other image is a democracy in the Western world, Western Hemisphere. A third is that you are wrestling with the idea whether you should become a member of Asia, because Asia is rising so fast. Very impressive dynamics about the momentum. You could be an independent continental economy. So which one is more about the true national identity of Australia? Do you think your country is somehow split and still find yourself wrestling with the idea or constant question about the national identity?
I think my answer to your question is that all countries' national identities change, including China's. China's national identity today is different to what it was in 1966. It's different to what it was in 1976. It's different to what it was in 1948. We all change. product of domestic and international circumstances. And we're no different to anybody else. Our nation evolves as well. I think on the question of identification with Asia, we have no choice in that matter. We are part of Asia. That's where geography has landed us. In the first meeting of the non-aligned movement at Bandung in the 1950s, Prime Minister Pandit Nehru of India invited Australia and New Zealand as well to attend as observers, but encouraging them to become part of the wider region. And since then, I think we Australians at least have been on a national journey. It's very difficult to identify any major Asian institution where Australia is not a member. We're a founding member of APEC. We're a founding member of the East Asian Summit. We're a member of the Asian-Europe Dialogue, ASEM, and we sit on the Asian side. It often amuses the Europeans that we sit on the Asian side. Therefore, when you look at the principal institutions of our region, ASEAN Regional Forum, we're members, and we have been really from the beginning. I think the other thing to bear in mind about Asian identity is that you know as well as I do that Chinese identity is radically different to Japanese, it's radically different to Indian, it's radically different to Indonesian. And so therefore the notion of Pan-Asian identity is a very complex one. And we're very happy to be part of this region. And finally, if you look at the makeup of Australia's population, it's much more multicultural in reality than many other countries in the world. 5% of Australia's population is Chinese. I think 70% of Australia's population continues to be European. The rest are from everywhere else. So we, like you, are changing.
Australia cannot deliver a single voice. Look at what Victoria did recently. It signed a memorandum of understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative, the first Australian state to join the BRI. However, instead of looking forward to opportunities for Victoria, some in your country reacted with a hostile attitude towards the BRI. For example, Peter Jennings, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute director, viewed the MOU as a form of inappropriate political interference by China. Of course, China won't accept this accusation.
Well, I haven't followed that debate in Australia because I live here in the United States. I think my Chinese friends would understand what I've said on the public record for years now. I, Lao Lu, have supported the Belt and Road Initiative from the beginning. Do you know why? Pretty simple. Because the developing world needs to build infrastructure, and China is offering to invest in that infrastructure. And that's why I have been a supporter. I went to the launch of this conference in Beijing in 2017, which Xi Jinping spoke at, and my position hasn't changed. China, in experiencing the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is going to run into a whole lot of practical obstacles, which it has. And I know from my friends in Beijing that China is constantly subjecting its own Belt and Road Initiative to significant internal review about transparency, about financial rates of return, labour standards, environmental standards, foreign policy reaction. But I say to the international community, that's normal if you're going to run a program as big as the BRI. So I think in the international community there'll be different reactions to the BRI, but I go back to a core point. If you want to implement the Sustainable Development Goals for the poor countries of the world, you need public investment in economic infrastructure. And China, through the BRI, is offering that.
President Xi Jinping stands for a new world that's more inclusive, depending on interconnectivity. Part of that could be made possible by the BRI and the execution of this blueprint. The issue is, as one of the leading articles of Economist, a renowned journal that I like so much since the 1980s, said in one of the cover stories, the 5G war between the two countries is actually a battle for digital leadership in shaping the future of the world. Do you believe this is the fundamental root cause behind the growing momentum of unilateralism and protectionism that President Trump tries to push forward? Is it harmful, or you can understand your American allies' motivation?
Well, President Trump is unique.
That's a very diplomatic wording.
When you look at his position on protectionism, as a Republican president, it's unusual. And as an ally of the United States, we are deeply anti-protectionist. We are strong supporters of free trade and free investment flows in the rest of the world. So, when we look at President Trump on the protectionism question, we really scratch our heads and say, what the hell's going on here? We also think it's bad economics. When you implement protectionist policies, it depresses economic growth, it depresses jobs growth, and it depresses the ability to raise living standards. So the United States, in its personal embrace by the President of a protectionist strategy, we don't think is good for the global economy at all. And we say that pretty clearly to the Americans. I also think the President's Republican Party is split right down the middle on these questions. Most Republicans historically are free traders. It's the Democrats who are usually protectionists. And here we have the irony of a Democrat president producing the Trans-Pacific Partnership based on the principles of free trade, and a Republican president coming in to kill it. Strange times in America.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, and he also recently published a book, Prime Years. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please.
What I worry about with neo-McCarthyism is there becoming a wider social movement supported by some in politics, which begins to target people based on their racial identification rather than the fact of their underlying citizenship. The US-China relationship is phenomenally complex.
What should be done to avert the worst-case scenario?
One of the best ways of avoiding that is to maximize the level of mutual economic dependence.
Welcome back, sir.
Good to be with you.
The next question is, where are we headed in terms of a China-Australia relationship? It seems there is a China-bashing campaign in your country, accusing China of meddling your politics, and the South China Sea is one of the issues on the agenda of your politicians. But at the same time, the Morrison government announced a 44 million Australian dollar funding for the new National Foundation for Australia-China Relations in a bid to turbocharge Beijing ties. What does that mean?
I've lived in the United States for the last 4 years or more. So when you ask me about the detail of the current state of Australia-China relations, I'm a little bit out of date, to be quite honest. I spend most of my time in a much more important relationship, which is the Chinese relationship with the United States. That's what I spend most of my working days on. But both in the US and Australia, there have been large debates about, quote, Chinese influence in domestic politics. I follow those debates.
Is that a debate on conspiracy theory, which cannot hold firm to the ground?
Well, when you have these two countries, Australia and the United States, are countries of laws. I have a very simple proposition. If anyone, foreign or domestic, breaks our domestic laws, then obviously they're going to be held responsible under the law. However, we need to be very careful in the implementation of those laws and not to engage in what I have described in both countries as the dangers of neo-McCarthyism. And that is in the prosecution of the independence of our domestic political systems, not to launch a broader movement which assumes that, for example, Chinese Australians or Chinese Americans are somehow unpatriotic Australians or unpatriotic Americans. That's the danger we ran into in the 1950s in this country. I don't want to see it 50 years later.
Are you suggesting quietly that there could be a repeat of the McCarthyist hysteria that probably characterizes the present-day politics in the United States? It's a matter of a hysteria. To be politically correct, I mean, it sounds like an obsessive concern for all Americans across the aisle of the two parties, for elites, for many people in the establishment. This is dangerous. I mean, this threatens to derail a healthy development of the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. That could be a danger for the rest of the world.
Look, any democracy, like any political system, needs to be vigilant about maintaining the integrity of its institutions, whether it's the parliamentary process, the electoral process, or whatever. In the United States, we've had this huge debate about the influence of Russia on the 2016 presidential elections. Not China, by the way, Russia. However, my argument is simple. That is a legitimate debate. How do we maintain the integrity of our domestic political institutions? Then there is a separate debate about how do you ensure that we do not tolerate the emergence of a racist campaign against a particular group in our democratic societies. And so what I worry about with neo-McCarthyism is there becoming a wider social movement supported by some in politics, which begins to target people based on their racial identification rather than the fact of their underlying citizenship. And so in this country, the United States, I've given speeches warning against neo-McCarthyism. In my own country, Australia, I've given speeches warning against neo-McCarthyism. And at the same time, I'm also a passionate defender of the integrity of our democratic institutions.
What do you think should be the healthy attitude towards the existence of China? Do you think it's high time to recognize China and its niche in the world market?
Well, you're looking at someone who's constantly argued that the most intelligent path to the future is one of comprehensive economic integration between China and the West and the rest of the world, including my own country. By the way, on the question of resources curse, people have said that about Australia for 150 years. Mm-hmm. We still have the 5th highest living standards in the world, but you never know. We've faced this threat before, we'll face it again. And remember, the resources sector in Australia represents perhaps 10% of GDP. The rest of GDP in Australia is generated from elsewhere. So, for the future, it's critical that we have a full and open economic relationship with China. But China, I say this to you, itself imposes restrictions on where foreigners can invest within its country. You have restrictions on what we can do to invest in the Chinese broadband network.
Is that because the alleged developing country status in the WTO, and after 15 years of grace period, China will seriously perhaps consider the importance of reforming WTO and will promise to further open up, to live up to the expectations of our trading partner like Australia and the United States? Therefore, it won't necessarily be a major issue in the trade talks between Washington and Beijing.
It may evolve in that direction. Mm-hmm. But up until now, there's been widespread economic engagement between our countries, that's Australia and China, and the United States and China, in multiple sectors of the economy. But the bottom line is, on the Chinese side, what I've observed, is that in certain sectors, both for economic or national security reasons, you have restrictions. I understand that, and I accept. The same applies in Western countries like mine. We'll have some economic restrictions through various firms that we may wish to protect from foreign investment or takeover, and there may be certain sectors for national security reasons which we've about. Now, there's no exact science in this. In a grown-up world, to paraphrase your language before, beyond ideological struggle, then the bottom line is, yes, all these things should be blended one into the other. But you know something, my friend? We're not quite there yet. Maybe we're on a journey towards that point on the horizon.
Maybe not halfway through yet.
Well, I hope we're further than that. And I'm one of the great globalizers. You know, I've seen where China has come from. I first went to work there in 1984. China of 1984 is vastly different from the China of 2019. It's an infinitely more globalized country. And this is a great thing for China and the world. But now we face a new set of challenges. They all looked big back then. I'm sure they look big now, but I think we'll get through them.
You have talked a lot about what China should do to guarantee this healthy relationship, but this is the supply side. What about the demand side, the U.S.? Now, this year witnesses the 40th anniversary of our bilateral relationship since the Carter administration in 1979. Given the mounting tensions arising from the standoff between the two biggest economies, what should be done to avert the worst-case scenario between Washington and Beijing?
Well, Graham Allison's a good friend of mine, the author of Thucydides' Trap, so I'm very familiar with his writings on this subject. I'm also familiar with what President Xi Jinping has said about Thucydides' Trap, which is, it must be avoided. I agree with that. And my own writings on this subject are entitled The Avoidable War, the future of US-China relations. So given the current content of the US-China relationship, what I argue for is rebuilding positive constituencies for the relationship here within the United States itself. Once this trade deal is completed between China and the United States, what I would like to see is the trade deal leading to a new momentum to conclude a bilateral investment treaty. I'd like to see also the widening of financial market reforms within China, extending to much greater interplay between the capital markets of both countries as well. And the reason I say all those things is not only is it good for the economies of both countries, but it's also good in terms of the level of economic, shall I say, mutual dependency. And if we're talking about the best means to avoid Thucydides' trap, one of the best ways of avoiding that is to maximize the level of mutual economic dependency. And that's what I'd like to see unfold: trade, investment, capital markets in the future.
Unfortunately, China has been designated most serious threat to the U.S. national security across the aisle by the two parties in the D.C. Now, instead of giving an easy label or an easy and simple definition to this bilateral relationship, what can be done to avert going back to the Cold War?
Well, remember, the big characteristic of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was that there was no economic engagement between those two. None. Secondly, in third countries, they were fighting proxy wars all the time. In Latin America, Africa, Asia. Between China and the United States today, you have one of the biggest economic relationships in the world. And secondly, you're not fighting proxy wars anywhere in the world.
And President Xi Jinping made that very clear in Cairo when he was visiting Egypt. China would not fight a turf war, would not have a war for sphere of influence or a proxy war.
So I think we need to be very careful about anyone, whether it's in Beijing or Washington, beginning to say that we're now into a new Lengjian. The Cold War had a completely different set of characteristics. The US-China relationship is phenomenally complex. I'm the first to agree with that. I sit in the middle of it. But it ain't a Cold War, let me tell you, because I'm old enough to remember what that Cold War was like. No, we need new thinking, fresh thinking, in order to, as I said, avoid Thucydides' trap. And that means, in my judgment, to really deepen the economic engagement between the two. If the two economies begin to decouple around technology and other elements of economic engagement, that's when there is a danger of beginning to head in a Cold War direction.
Certainly the evolution of this bilateral relationship is no easy job, Mr. Prime Minister, but can you elaborate a little bit more about what you call constructive realism in engineering healthy development of this relationship between Washington and Beijing?
My friends in Washington and Beijing often say the problem with Zhongmei Guanxi, US-China relations, is that there is a lack of strategic trust. 互信. Well, to which I say, that's natural. So what are you going to do about it? To which they say, we're not sure. To which I say, let me tell you, as of 12 o'clock tomorrow, if I issued a statement saying China and the United States will now begin to strategically trust each other, everyone would laugh in Beijing and in Washington. As an American once said to me, strategic trust is much overrated. Now, my attitude is you only ever build trust either between people or between countries gradually over time. And you do so based on things that you do together. So when I talk about constructive realism, it's being realist about the absence of strategic trust, realist in understanding where there are some irreconcilable differences between China and the United States, political value system, Taiwan, etc. But constructive about the fact that there's a whole bunch of other areas where China and the United States have sufficient common values and sufficient common interests to actively cooperate. Things like North Korean nuclear proliferation, things like climate change, things like the bilateral investment treaty. My final point about constructive realism is if you start to do those things together and produce real results, bit by bit, they build strategic trust over time based on real experience, not an abstract doctrine.
Perhaps you are right, Mr. Prime Minister, but what do you think of this way out, constructive approach? That is to develop the ability to manage a crisis. Now, we don't bypass the dangers, the risks, the problems that do exist, that will exist in the foreseeable future. But the matter, by the end of the day, is how to manage the crisis, how to manage the misunderstanding and miscommunication. This ability really matters, right?
That's true. It's one of the reasons why the report of mine that you referred to, Constructive Realism, said that one of the areas that China and the United States could develop and agree on is rules of conduct for their navies and their air forces to avoid incidents at sea, incidents in the air, or, if they occur, how to manage them in a crisis so they don't escalate. Now, I'm sure not just because of my work, but many people's work, the United States and China during the course of 15-16 did reach agreements with each other and their armed forces on how to manage such incidents. So there has been some progress in this area. Of course, it needs to be extended so that we do not end up with conflict by accident, because my knowledge of conflict by accident is that it then tends to escalate into something on a much bigger scale.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your insightful analysis and very Chinese understanding about China. With that, we come to the end with this discussion with Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia. Perhaps Westerners would have to understand China is ready to provide more public service and public products for a majority of those who follow the evolution of China. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.